Hey there, this is Tom with the Diogenes Lamp podcast. I appreciate you listening in, and most importantly, I hope you enjoy what you hear. Before we start with today's episode, I'm going to ask you for a small favor. Believe it or not, history podcasts, especially in their early stages, tend not to be cash cows. Shocker, I know. I too was blindsided by this news. Now, I didn't go into this for the money, I think that much is obvious. But unfortunately, books, research materials, and equipment aren't free. Please, go to patreon.com/Diogenes Lamp Podcast, and for less than the price of a coffee once a month, you can become a member and get access to bonus episodes, recommended reading lists and documentaries, shout-outs, and anything else we'll offer in the future as this project grows. If you are especially broke, hey, I get it, but please, make sure to give us a 5-star review when you listen to us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, and subscribe to the pod on your preferred podcast listening medium. Your support is appreciated, and more importantly, it is needed in order to keep this operation going. On that note, I hope you have a great day, and now back to the show. Hey everyone, for today's episode I had on the pod someone who has been on here almost half a dozen times, Dr. Dale Pappas. As you've probably gathered by now, as a rule of thumb, whenever there is a topic that I'm either not confident enough to talk to you about myself, or that I feel could be better explained by a subject matter expert, well, I bring on the expert. If you've been following the Greek Civil War segment that we've had running for a while now, you've seen for yourself what a moving force Venizelos and Venizelism has been. But I don't think I've ever given you guys, the listeners, a proper introduction and a bit of a summary on just what the heck makes a Venizelist. What is Venizelism? Aside from tackling what a Venizelist is and the legacy of Venizelos, we also grappled with questions like, what's a Republican? A liberal? What role did the military play in politics during this era in Greek history? Aside from tackling what a Venizelist is and the legacy of Venizelos, we also grappled with questions like, what's a Republican? A liberal? What role did the military play in politics during this era in Greek history? And we also talked about patronage networks in the Greek military. Hope you guys enjoy this conversation and learn a couple of things. I know I did. Take care. At its base, like the most basic level, just, for the listeners who are just average Joes, what is a Venizelist?
I mean, for shorthand, a Venizelist is someone who is a really, really big supporter of Venizelos, the individual. They came at their support, meaning individual people and groups, even if we kind of build that out to constituents, for instance. They came at their support for Venizelos and Venizelism in different ways. And so this does speak to the fact that, like many isms and political parties in Greece in general, there's not really so much ideology driving a lot of these political forces. Uh, and it's true of many. I mean, we have to kind of course, separate the Communist Party, for instance, but we can pick any number of political parties in this time and also in different time periods, honestly, in Greek history, and see that there's not a lot of ideological difference. And this persists even after World War II, for example. Not a lot of ideological difference. It's mostly down to, if we're talking about politics, it's mostly down to the personalities and to their desire to maintain power or to get power if they don't really see that they have the political power in the country. And so Venizelism is not that different from many of these other political movements. It just so happens to be led by Venizelos, and we're just talking about how a lot of people backed Venizelos in different times because they liked him or they admired certain things about him. We could say the same thing about who didn't like Venizelos. A lot of it was not necessarily because they had major ideological differences, but they just didn't like the guy. They just really, it came down to just not really liking the
Yeah, they
personality,
really hated him.
right?
So yeah, there's a really good quote by Metaxas, which kind of like leads into exactly what you're saying, kind of that dichotomy of either he's the man and you're with him till the end, or my God, you hate him. And this is a direct quote from Metaxas, and he says, in quote, merely the fact that his name has been so dominant among all citizens of this country, with his supporters known as Venizelists and his opponents as anti-Venizelists, testifies to the significance of the deceased, meaning, this is right after he had died, and the role he played, end quote, right? And it's just like you're saying, right? It's like, my God, you love him or you hate him. And even if you talk to people today, historically, people that aren't PhDs that, it's hard to give unbiased, but, I feel like as a PhD and as a historian, we're supposed to give unbiased, unemotional takes on events and people and that kind of thing and try to sift through that. But if you talk to people that are just average Joes and, they have their guy that they hate or they like, if they really hate Venizelos, everything is Venizelos' fault. The we didn't get Constantinople because of Venizelos. The refugees collapsed because of Venizelos. We didn't get Cyprus because of Venizelos. We didn't get Northern Epirus because of blah, 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 and the list goes on. And the opposite, if you're a Venizelist, of course. Balkan Wars, we won. He did his best. It's the royalist fault. It was an impossible situation. Everyone loved him. He was the most eloquent. He was the best talker. Blah, blah, blah,
Right, right, right. I mean, and it's remarkable to think that even though we're saying all this about Venizelos, also what we were just saying is that he's not really even that unique in the political spectrum. That this was kind of the story, right? That people had their personalities that they liked, people they didn't like, and also the fact that people's ideas could evolve over time. Venizelos, for instance, I mean, we talk about Venizelists. Some people were hardcore Venizelists from beginning to end, and even kind of beyond. Other people were Venizelists for certain reasons at certain times, and drifted away, or saw that they got what they wanted from Venizelos, and then they could move away and kind of do their own thing. So there's also that kind of shifting sand there too, that makes it difficult to sort of pin down who is a Venizelist, who is an anti-Venizelist. Um, Depends on exactly when we're talking about too in some instances.
let's talk about, so let's get into that shifting thing. Before we get into this shifting though, I just want to pin down like two more things. I myself have had trouble with these things, so it'd be nice to talk to like an expert. Liberalism, a liberal, and republicanism. What kind of makes each of these? How are they connected or disconnected from Venizelism? Are they mutually exclusive of each other? That kind of thing. If you could kind of drill down a little bit on that, to just surface level, it doesn't have to be anything crazy, right? Loaded question. Yeah, I know.
For us, I think it's helpful, and it is important to actually have a sense of this. I like to think of it again, looking at Venizelos, for instance, and the sort of totality of his career in politics and as the leader really of the country or as the leader in opposition, and looking at that in terms of liberalism, and also to an extent republicanism and what that might look like in Greece. And so, yes, Venizelos led what was called the Liberal Party, and did often, for a good, especially good portion of his political career, uh, did support a lot of what were essentially liberal ideas in the wider European context, borrowing a lot off of the European liberalism of the 19th century, that had really begun to sort of trickle into Greece gradually over the course of the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century. And so I think what we can look at that as is these are the areas that, these are the areas where Venizelos was, for instance, trying to make Greece a bit more of a participatory democracy, for example, getting more state involvement, say, in offering certain services, especially education. Education actually became a big platform for Venizelos, especially towards the end.
I feel like that's a big legacy of his, honestly, is the big expansion and education and mandatory education, yada yada. And
Yeah, and also, I mean, and sort of modernization in general too. I mean, public health, for example, being one of those areas that the Venizelos governments took special care to address. And so, in these areas, okay, this is sort of where the liberalism of Venizelos is at play, and so some of that bled into this support for republicanism. But of course, some of these things were areas that Venizelos was working on when he was prime minister in a constitutional monarchy, and it wouldn't have necessarily meant that his government couldn't do these things. And so that's where it's also a little bit tricky to kind of get into liberalism and republicanism, and if there's such a strong sort of connection between the two, because I mean there were supporters of Venizelos who were staunch Republicans. There were also some who were still very loyal to the monarchy and to having a constitutional monarchy. And the same is true for anti-Venizelists. Even many leading anti-Venizelists who we sort of for shorthand say are monarchists essentially because they served essentially at the pleasure of the king in government when they defeated Venizelos. Um, they were not necessarily themselves very hardcore royalists. They were probably more easily identified as people who just didn't like Venizelos or had certain types of interests, especially agrarian interests, like agrarian populist interests, that made it quite difficult to support Venizelos, especially towards the end of his time in power. These agrarian populists would have been coming up against a lot of Venizelos's policies involving agriculture.
oh, his second term, 28 to 32, yeah, which was kind of like a flop. But I mean, debatable how much was it his fault, or it was a Great Depression and whatnot. But
And it's interesting. I mean, yes, we say it's a flop. No, I mean, and oftentimes, of course, especially in general histories of Greece, it's not going to get a lot of attention, a few paragraphs, really. Some historians have actually started to sort of recalibrate our ideas about that last Venizelos government, given the fact that it was, of course, very difficult to achieve concrete results because of the Great Depression, because of the kind of general political instability and kind of condition of society at that point in Greece. But there were some areas where there was at least a foundation that was set for future developments, especially when it came to the economy. One of those things being a radically different approach to agriculture and to commercial agriculture than had been seen before. Some of this, like I said, was costly politically, ultimately for Venizelos. But in the end, that was actually a sort of necessary reform that would take shape really after World War II. But it starts then. And also, there's a little bit of industrialization that occurs at that time, starts to professionalize some industries, including tourism, in that era. So it's an early foundation for a lot of reforms that would come to matter once the dust had settled at the end of the Civil War, especially for the country's economy to begin to rebound. So a lot of that actually happens during the end of Venizelos' time in power. But of course, like you were saying, I mean, most of what we think of when we think of that final government is the economic crisis, and also, of course, the special law, and this kind of beginnings of,
Oh, the Onimon, yeah.
right, this sort of what, of course, is often seen shorthand as purely an anti-communist measure, but is really, of course, since it stays on the books for such a long time in different forms, basically gives the state a tool with which to crush any form of dissent, anything at all, really, that the state comes to identify as dissent. Of course, most of that is and directed at communists or suspected communists, but is used more broadly over time, and even in that moment as well. And so some of that also leads to questions going back to that idea about liberalism and to what extent Venizelos, for instance, was a supporter of liberalism or a proponent of this. By the end, there, Venizelos does a lot of things that don't really line up with liberal principles and tenets. One of those things, of course, being supportive of that kind of legislation is a bit of an alarm bell there. And also the fact that it's directed, of course, not just at communists, but also, and this is what isn't as widely known, but it's also directed a lot at minority groups that are still in Greece.
If you can speak on that, if you want to.
I mean, I guess just briefly, since it's touching on that moment in the late 20s, early 30s, one of the things that Venizelos does that runs counter to what I was saying earlier about sort of efforts to make Greece a more participatory democracy. The Venizelist government there at the end of the 20s and into the early 30s uses these kinds of pieces of legislation and some other policies to really try to target and discourage active political participation, especially at the national level, among the minority communities of Greece. So different Albanian communities, for example, right? Uh, right, Italians, Maltese, anyone who was seen as not Greek, quote unquote, would make it, and often that was done, of course, too, with the recognition on the part of Venizelos that those groups in national elections were overwhelmingly supportive of anti-Venizelos groups.
Yes, this is a charge that's I've heard this before, and that it even played a role in the 1920 election, and that it was a big deal that a lot of people held against, the Muslims of Greece and the Jews of Greece, especially apparently, and stuff like that. That they were overwhelmingly. I forgot about the Jews, but the Muslims especially, and it's a big charge held against them that a lot of people get pissed off about.
And some of that, I mean, speaking, say, from the perspective of anti-Venezuelist political forces in the country, some of it was just opportunism as well. That once they realized, once we are now facing this massive voting block of these refugees that have citizenship that are going to back Venizelos and make it basically insurmountable to win elections, we have to turn to these people and say, we're your only lifeline here. If you're planning to stay in the country, we're the ones that will actually give you a platform of sorts, or at least respect, kind of respect your right to be in your community there. Venizelos and his people want to get rid of you. Uh,
Right. There's no guarantee about tomorrow with you. Who knows what they'll do next time, or you'll be disenfranchised or whatever the case. That's interesting.
right. And so even though we're talking about all this with Venizelos too, I think of maybe the most fascinating fact, and I don't know how many people even know this, but if you actually take a step back here and say, okay, we're talking about this last government as like a total flop. If that was his only time in government, it would not be, Venizelos would not be a widely popular figure by any means for any group. But that 1928 government is actually the only government in the whole interwar period that is one, duly elected, and two, serves out its full parliamentary term.
Holy shit, you're right. I guess you're right, yeah. Because, I mean, there wasn't probably one that, yeah. Because literally from 1916 on, there's coups and instability.
Right.
From the Novriana on.
Yeah. And there would be after. So
Right, the
it's
interwar period
it's
even, yeah.
right. So it's just one of those things that we say, oh, it's very unsuccessful.
It
This
was during the
is not
Great Depression as well,
right.
It's funny. I always think sometimes if Metaxas died for his legacy, I feel like the perfect time. If you were choosing to die at a time to give your legacy, that'd be the perfect time. You just beat the Italians, the Germans haven't come yet, you die. Great. Venizelos almost, if Metaxas exploded as a star, Venizelos almost burned out, I guess, if you know what I'm saying. But his
Yeah,
first term was so strong, it didn't even make a difference. And sorry to cut you off, but I just want to read something because, like you were saying, if you were just to go off of his second term, he'd be like kind of like a no-name, right? But, and this is a book, by the way, Dr. Pappas recommended to me, The Military and Greek Politics from Independence to Democracy. Great book. Just like you said, it's like a really nice little read. Very well written. I mean, Thanos Veremis is a really great author on this stuff. He does a really great job. So let me just read you in the back. I love this book too because in the back it has little like 2 paragraphs of like everyone you need to know. Honestly, just prime. Love it, love it, love it. Ionian Vision has a similar thing too, actually in their back. But let's just go to Eleftherios Venizelos. First line of his mini profile: the most important political figure in 20th century Greek history. Like you're saying, with the arguably flop of a second term and 2 failed coups. Let's get back. One more thing. Can you touch briefly on republicanism then? Is this just in the tradition of like the belief in needing a constitution, emphasis on, the opposite per se of constitutional monarchy, would you say? Is that super surface level?
and it's one of those things too that people have remarked on, that this question of republicanism versus monarchism and what form of government, for instance, and even down to what should the Constitution say, what kind of legislature should Greece have, all these kinds of things. Just like we were saying earlier, sometimes people kind of flip flop their positions on these things as time would tell in some instances. What we can say, I think, with more certainty too, is that this was a lot more of a high level question rather than a sort of general society question. There were a lot more people who were committed to these ideas, who were people serving already in certain institutions or who had a certain stature in society. They tended to be a lot more involved and sort of having an opinion about whether Greece should be a republic or a monarchy than a lot of ordinary people. And that actually, the military in part, there's people within the military, people within the government, politicians, business people of stature, different people in society would be more connected, a little bit more checked into the different the wheelings and dealings in Parliament and things of that sort. They tended to be the people who had a bit more of an opinion about whether Greece should really be a republic or a monarchy. And so I think in part that might actually lead us to that same thing that we were talking about before, that it's a lot of Greek politics is the individual and the groups, the sort of clients that individual gathers around them, rather than a sort of base and what a base wants. It's very top down, and especially in that era. And so we do have a hard time kind of sort of parsing out all of these different positions, in part because it changes so much, because we have to take into consideration it's people's self-interest at times too. So, if they're not so committed, so dogmatic, then things could change, and that might totally shift the sort of public discourse in that time.
Self-preservation's the first rule of politics, absolutely. And especially when you're given, when you take into account that even geographical boundaries are changing at this time. You know, there's giant refugee flows, and it's like as Americans, I feel like we take it for granted to not go through massive changes, and and it's like, how could the politician not change his views given certain changes with things that had to be done and whatnot? So I get it. I mean, I feel like it's very easy to get into the stereotypical, like, oh, from ancient times, like countries like Greece believe in a strong leader, Alexander the Great, or Archegos, the leader, and blah, 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 blah. And I'm sure there's part of that. I get that. I feel like people are naturally want to believe in a leader, and, definitely we're feeling that here in America. I mean, it's definitely people want leadership and they're attracted to leadership and yada, yada. But I feel like that simplifies it a lot. Doesn't take into account other factors.
Right, and with Greece especially too, we have to think about those sorts of, in political science terms, right? Like the political cleavages that existed in that time. A lot of them had historical roots and just kind of evolved over time as well. So some of what we're talking about in terms of the interwar period, yes, is a product of different events and circumstances of the interwar period, but also to some extent too is built upon some earlier developments and earlier conflicts and tensions that were unresolved just within modern Greek history. Some of that going all the way back to the 1820s, for instance.
Yeah, you can even go farther back. And way that's before 1897. I mean, I'm a little familiar, but I'm very, very unwell read, not well read on people like, Trikoupis or Delianis or Koumoundouros, those types of politicians that you're referring to that really, also had their own beef, before Venizelos and not Venizelos, there was, I believe, Koumoundouros and Trikoupis hated each other and they were rivals. And if I'm not, I could be wrong on that, but
The Lianis, the Kupis,
is that it? Those guys?
they kind of flip flopped and had.
Yeah, that's from kind of what I've read a little bit from one of the small bit that I've read on them. It's really interesting. Koumoundouros was a Magnati. I didn't know. I had no idea. That's funny. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, this is kind of, it's not something that we can really spend a lot of time on right now, but if you're interested in talking about it more, I mean, one of those things that we can also say about this, speaking in that kind of longer historical term, too, is the cleavage in Greece or the divide in Greece between diasporas. The question of who is Greek, also should people who were born in Greece, and in that sense, what does that mean? Are we talking about old Greece? Are we talking specifically about, say, if you're from Peloponnese or Attiki, for example, do you have more of a say or do you have more rights than somebody who's from, who's a Fanariotti, for instance? Um,
Wow. I didn't even think about that from back then because, I feel like that's something that's definitely talked about now and it's definitely discussed now. And it's just interesting to hear you bring it up back then as well. Different context, but similar as well. I mean,
right. So, I mean, even though that was in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, people are having those kind of fights. That's not unlike the same kind of political battles that people are having in the 1920s and 1930s, 1940s.
calling
Some ex-
Venizelos a Senegalese goat and being scared of Cretans walking around and
right. And then even right, and then even speaking of this time period too, 1920s, 1930s, you also have now the new diaspora, the diaspora, say in the Americas, for example, also getting involved in these politics.
that's amazing. Let's talk a little bit. We don't have to talk a bit about it, a lot about it, but I think it is really interesting. I think it'd be really well for the listeners to like hear it from you as well and see what you have to say about it. But like the flip flopping, this I don't want to call it flip flopping, but like the political changes, right? Like I remember you and me went a couple weeks ago. We're talking about Papoulas, General Papoulas, the guy who came over. He was in charge before Hadzi Anestis in Asia Minor. He was royalist. when everything went to hell in a handbag. I believe at the trial of the six, he was against the royalists. In 1935 coup, he switched from being, by that time he had switched from being a royalist to like more centrist. And then in 1935 he participated, and then he was executed when the coup failed. As he was executed as a Venizelist. Condilis, famous example. Are there any other ones you can think of? Those are the only two big ones, the big ones, anyways. I'm sure there's other. I mean, even like Epangalos, right? I mean, you would have thought like, oh, hardcore Venizelist, right? If I'm not mistaken, during his dictatorship, he persecuted other Venizelists.
And in that sense, too, again, we're not talking about a very unique situation like you're mentioning. There's a lot of people, and you can go down a long list of people in the military, people who are politicians or who were their sort of clients in the civil service, for instance. A lot of people wore different hats at different times, supported different people, felt like it was better to sort of lay low to.
Zavicianos, I don't know if you ever heard that name. He was interior. That guy was all left, right, center, all over the place as well.
I mean, there were some people who were just kind of sort of born conspirators too.
True, good point.
If there was
It's a
some,
natural, it's their
if,
natural state.
if there was something that, oh well, now I don't like this person, or someone's offering me something here. If I participate, what can I get out of this? Because of course, we don't talk about this part necessarily so much with respect to these different military coups in Greece, and that's I think where the book that you mentioned is particularly strong too. Each of these coups, of course, have their own life and afterlife, for instance, and in that sense, it's no different than a lot of other military coup or counter coup attempts in history in general. That in terms of like the art of these things, or sort of what goes into these different attempts, right? That we have to remember too that these individuals have their own self-interest to think about, and so
They're
a lot
people.
of the right, and so a lot of the times too, a lot of the right, and so a lot of the times too, okay, some of these people may have been ideologically wedded to certain ideas, or may have had their pet projects that they wanted to see supported, or if they felt betrayed by someone, if they thought that they were going to go through with a certain project that they liked. But a lot of the times it comes down to those sort of personal relationships, people sitting down, meeting and talking it out, writing it down on stationery or something.
Right.
This is what we're going to do, and this is
Walking
who
away
gets
from a
what.
meeting and saying, I really like that guy. He's cool. He gets me. Stuff like
who,
that.
who,
It's like,
who gets what, and
right.
what's my role going to be? What do
Good.
I
Yeah,
have to
good
do? What
point.
do I get out of this? I mean, it's something that Napoleon did, for instance, when he was taking power in 1799. Had to go through a whole big thing, meeting with different officers. This is what you can do. Uh, what do you want? What are you looking for? What are your ambitions here? What do you think the right kind of government should be? And so these Greek officers are doing it, of course, not with the same level of historical importance as Napoleon's coup, but it's the same kind of thing. What can we do? Uh, who feels aggrieved? I know this person is trustworthy, or I know this person is connected with this person, and they participated in something before. Maybe they'll come back. So there was a lot of that, whether we're talking about 35, whether you're talking about earlier
It's just amazing
counter coup
because
attempts.
these guys are so. I mean, I read somewhere one time, I forgot who it was. I think it was Andre Girolamatos, and he had pretty much framed it. He had said some kind of line like, the politics, the power politics of the Greek political scene. In other words, like the competition of it. Like it's like a game. It's like a sport. Like you look at it, it's like the NBA, right? I got Plastidas in this corner and Venizelos in another, and these guys are plotting against each other, and like at any moment someone might, in that period anyways, of course, in the interwar period I'm talking about specifically, where there's such everything's so in flux, right?
And I think the thing to point out too that's important to keep in mind is this was all out in the open. Okay, the conspiratorial stuff, of course, was clandestine. Of course, people were meeting in secret, this and that. They obviously weren't going to expose their plans and this and that, but people knew. people knew that this sort of stuff was afoot, and not just in Greece. This was known internationally. I mean, if you read old like foreign affairs magazines, for instance, from the 20s and 30s, there are articles about how the generals call the shots in Greece, and that the military is this major bastion of society, and they call the shots in politics, and this was known. You could read a New York Times article from that era, and this would be mentioned. This was not something that uh,
This was the
would have
way
been.
that things worked, in other words, is what you're saying. This was expected almost.
This was sort of a thing that people understood would happen in Greece, and I guess kind of like if there's certain parallels you would say today, people always talk about, for instance, France, the various protests in France, and the sort of tendency to have these riots in France for any sort of any reason really, just some sort of political, right, some sort of organized response that way. That, oh, if you're planning to go to France, right? Well, your trip might be interrupted by strikes and demonstrations, things of that nature. Uh, that's how people thought about Greece, and I mean, not that they don't still say that to some extent,
Right.
but it's a lot different now. The idea of like industrial action versus, oh, there's going to be an attempt to overthrow the government, and
Right.
maybe
Those are
that'll
two
get
totally
violent.
different. Yeah, that's very, those are very
I
different.
don't remember which year it was, which coup it referred to, but possibly 35. There was an article in the New York Times that profiled a group of tourists on a cruise that had just gotten to Athens, just had gotten to Piraeus in the days in that build up to a coup attempt in the country, and people were kept on the ships. And they were all excited because they wanted to go see the war,
Get
as
out.
they called it.
Get out of here.
So there are a lot, and believe it or not, that's not the only instance that I've seen with reference to, say, tourists visiting and being sort
Coup
of excited.
tourism. Like medical
Right,
tourism, coup
right.
tourism.
And it's actually, believe it or not, too, and I think it is 35 in this instance. There is a memoir, a travel, I guess not so much a memoir, probably more of a travelogue, written by an Australian, by a British Australian guy who had gone to Greece in the mid 30s and was talking about the very first page of that memoir was all about how Greeks are sort of obsessed with these military coup and counter coup attempts, and how this is sort of a part of daily life, that the tanks could be on the street at any time. And I'll never forget, there was a reference to the way that the newspapers actually sort of seemed to encourage it, that the language was inflammatory, and even down to the imagery of the text written in big, bold red letters, that he was saying it was like the color of blood, that this was sort of inspiring violence. And believe it or not, I mean, that to me, this is sort of a separate aside too, but it's interesting to bring up in terms of this discussion of sort of instability in society, or this kind of political violence, for example. It reminded me a little bit, that sort of reference to the newspapers in those days being inflammatory too, that supporting one side or another, for instance, politically, not unlike the common criticism today of especially sports journalism in Greece, and especially related to football or soccer, that there is a lot of influence, a lot of studies out there saying, the language of the sports journalism pieces in Greece is way too inflammatory and seems to essentially encourage hooliganism. And so, in that sense, it's kind of the modern day version of the inflammatory political discourse that is not really seen anymore. Unfortunately, really in Greece, that there's not um, really that many instances of sort of inflammatory political discourse in the different papers, even against one another, to the same extent that, of course, we saw 80 years ago, for example. But we see it a lot to this day in terms of the sports journalism.
That's wild. Yeah, there's nothing like stoning effigies of Venizelos in the middle of Athens or whatever, what happened during the Novriana. That's nuts. Let's talk in. I think there's a bit of a segue that we can work off of here that you had touched on. The networks that allow like almost these like team kind of. I know that's not exactly what it is, but if you're a Venizelos, you're a Venizelist, right? Like I had a grandpa that was, from what I've heard, I never met the guy. It was like my pro papu, but he fought on. Supposedly, the story goes he fought under Venizelos in Asia Minor. Loved Venizelos, loved Plastiras. He had a Plastiras poster in his room, apparently. Like these were his guys, right? And like that's how it goes. These are your guys, right? Let's talk about and if you're a my dad had talked about how they had posters of Papagos, right? I said that right, his name Papagos, and he used them though for kites to fly, and apparently one of the gendarmes got mad at him and said, "You can't use that as a kite because it's a general. It's just well, he's a 7-year-old, 8-year-old kid." But what I want to talk about, sorry, I went off the side there, is the network of like patronage as a system, clientelism. What that because I feel like the average Joe, and like if you're not really privy to this stuff, it's going to seem so alien to you. And if you're not, I've never read about it before, but like, what is it, the patronage system or like the clientelism, and like even just like from a overhead view, square foot view overhead, like what does it mean like in politics and electoral politics and stuff like that in general, if you could?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and of course, it really defines a lot of modern Greek
Even
political
today.
history. Right. I
Yeah.
mean, it's this is not something that is unique to the interwar period, but that is one of those chapters where we really see an important instance of these different sorts of patron-client networks. And yes, we're talking, I suppose, about about separate uh, chains or separate sorts of groups between, say, civilian and military, but they are interconnected. So the military sort of, yes, had their own chains of patron-client relationships. I mean, obviously the most, I guess the most obvious one being the group attached to the crown, and specifically, of course, going back to say the National Schism days, or even before that, Balkan Wars days, and even before that, really, who was attached to the crown prince, who was attached to Constantine. Uh, a lot of those generals in the early 1900s, and especially going into the Balkan Wars, were essentially political appointees because they were in his circle.
Right.
Uh,
Loyal.
and, right, and
Known to be loyal anyways.
they were his people. They were part of that patron-client relationship with the crown prince. A lot of those generals in the early 1900s, and especially going into the Balkan Wars, were essentially political appointees because they were in his circle. Uh, and, right, and they were his people. They were part of that patron-client relationship with the crown prince at the top of it. And so there were these different military groups, and of course, as Venizelos grew more and more powerful, there were people who were attached to him, and there were also people who floated between those groups, or who, again, kind of going back to that idea of evolving over times. I think one of the more interesting characters there, not that he was in the military for a long time, but he has a connection to the military, and he did begin his career in the military service. Koko, Constantine Melas, the younger brother of Pavlos Melas, was very tight with the royal court, obviously, as the Melas family was sort of tight with the royals, and part of the sort of Greek elite, the Athenian aristocracy, pseudo aristocracy, really. And so Coco's career began as a naval officer, and he was a naval attaché, actually, in the Imperial Russian Navy during the Russo-Japanese War. And he got that because he was close to the royal family. I think the Queen, in particular, sponsored his sort of transfer to Russia to serve in that capacity. But once he got back to Greece, and of course, as the National Schism played out, Melas became a huge Venizelist, and backed Venizelos. Now he was someone who was sort of seen as above the fray, so to speak, not someone who would have been targeted, for instance, by one group or the other for sort of being a traitor to them. For example, you didn't really touch people like that because he had that national status, he had the name. So,
Right, he was a hero.
right. I
It'd be
mean,
like going after
when
Karaiskakis or,
right,
kind of like that.
you need to be careful with some of those people. So he was sort of one of those figures seen as like above the fray, though he did serve in Venizelos governments, but he was not necessarily, um, not necessarily targeted, for instance, for retribution by one group or another at different times. And so there were these different people too who floated between these patron-client networks. Uh, and like we were saying earlier, they are connected to the civilian politicians because obviously all the different leading military officers had their civilian politicians in their corner, and vice versa.
I feel like the most obvious example is Venizelos. Plastiras. Venizelos had many, but his biggest guy was, I feel like Plastiras is what everyone knows him, those two four together.
And I think it's important to point out too that this was such a sort of understood development in the country that this is sort of the way
Yeah.
politics
It's a
work.
way of doing business.
Right, you had these kind of networks. They did interconnect at times, and obviously for electoral purposes, they certainly linked up so that there would be a politician who would serve. Except in those instances, of course, when an officer would overthrow the government. But a lot of the times too, some of these big changes happened precisely because there was an absence or there was a rupture in these patron-client relationships that they couldn't sort of get on the same page, or there wasn't, deemed to be a suitable civilian politician, for instance, to do this. We see that probably, I mean, I don't know if we would say this is the most famous case, but it's certainly the first thing that comes to mind for me is the junta, for example. So in the 60s, why is it that an officer is the prime minister? Why do they always have generals and colonels and why are these military officers always in these different government posts? It was because they couldn't find. Also, they just didn't have in their pockets civilian politicians who would back them. They were more the civilian politicians who mattered too in Greek society at that time were generally seen as their
Right. So they were
they were
maybe
men,
exiled or in jail or
right?
one
Or
of the
they were
two.
going after them.
Right.
So that was a situation where there was an absence of civilian political leadership. The military couldn't turn, if they wanted to make things change, they couldn't turn to somebody so readily. Same thing happened in World War II in terms of Axis governments. Was a reason why it was very difficult to find civilian political leadership who was Greek because there wasn't really a lot of willingness, right, or really a willingness to get involved at that point. So at times these patron-client relationships that were very well established and in some instances, like you were mentioning with Venizelists, for example, lasted for some time. Sometimes that wasn't the case. Sometimes there were these ruptures, and that caused some big changes to occur.
That's interesting. Yeah. I mean, Venizelos Plastiras is the big one. And then obviously I feel like you could talk about, I believe it's Duzmanis. I mean, the king, Duzmanis, and then through Duzmanis Metaxas, or maybe more directly. But, the royalists, the monarchy, and Metaxas, obviously, also super obvious. I think there's a quote in, it's a great quote in, we've talked about that book, P.J. Vattikiosis's Popular Autocracy. And it's like in German, but it's Queen Sophie saying like, "We have our man in Athens. His name is Yanni." Like, like straight up, like this is our guy. And there's all types. I mean, that one book that you recommend is a great book, and it there's a couple pages on this kind of stuff, and like Paraskevopoulos was a client of Pangalos. Papathanassopoulos was a client of Plastiras. Sarafis, who depending when I'm going to drop this episode, it'll probably be a while, but Sarafis, who will end up being the commander of Hellas, who's a Venizelis, is a protege of Othonios, and Othonios played a decently big part in the trial of the six. So it's like all goes like these guys are all just connected and connected and connected. It's just so yeah. Let's get a little more into back to Venizelos. He's such a big name, obviously. He passes away in 1936 after two unsuccessful coups. He's involved with one more so than the other, but he was still involved in both. Yada, yada, yada. He dies. It's a huge, huge politician that dies. In his absence, what happens to like Venizelism as a force? Given that it's just like you said, it wasn't like an ideology per se as much as it was attached to a person. What's left over after the actual person dies?
It's a great question because it's honestly something that, like we were mentioning, it's hard to sort of pinpoint what then is Venizelism without Venizelos, even taking into account the fact that Venizelism has evolved like the man in power has evolved over time. And so even with that fact, there is really an open question now with the death of Venizelos. What's to happen to his political legacy? And of course, as is sort of typically the case, especially in Greece, the son, of course, is in politics and eventually, you know, becomes somewhat of a major player, but not really with much staying power, not with as big of a base, nowhere near the kind of base and support that his father had. And the same really becomes true of these different people who are players in politics in Greece in the 1920s and 1930s. Few of them have staying power. There are a couple that are still around or have family that are around in the 40s and 50s, for example. But for the most part, this is really an end of an era with Venizelos' death.
It seems to be in. Sorry to interrupt you, but also with that entire round of people that died leading up to Metaxas, right? I mean, you had a lot of great politicians. I mean, people don't live forever; they die, they get old, especially in the 1930s, where average life expectancy wasn't 80 years old back then. So it makes sense.
And some of this, of course, too, is I think just we can say for shorthand, just this idea that when an individual has so much power and influence over their political party and or movement, when they are no longer on the scene, how valuable is their brand of politics versus someone else's? And I think we've seen that repeatedly in Greece. This is sort of a typical hallmark of Greek politics. There have been very few political parties, period, that have managed to survive a sort of transition of leadership. I mean, ND is a very rare example of like a mainstream leading political party that has gone through a succession of leadership. Okay, it's a handful of people really that have been super important in the party, but even that is a little unique. And I mean, I think we're sort of running into that question now too with Syriza, for example. Can Syriza really
Oh yeah,
be viable with
no more
Tsipras?
Tsipras. Yeah, right. Good point.
So 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 the same question sort of emerges and back in the 1920s, 1930s, and even 1950s, 1960s. This question of what do you do when the leader is no longer running that party, chances are it's going to be a completely new political force, really. I mean, they might borrow some of the same ideas, they might sort of be loosely on the same side of things, but the people change, the names change, and it's more than a name change when it comes to these political forces in the country.
That's really interesting. And it's what I was thinking when you were saying that is the name change, people change. Also, like just with Syriza, I just finished reading the Last Bluff. You know that book about 2015 by those two female journalists. Great book. Highly recommend. Amazing book. Great, 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 great. So we're talking about Syriza and we're talking about Tsipras, and it's like also when a party comes to into existence, and I feel like this happens a lot in Greek history as well, with a very specific purpose, right? Syriza, no Troika. Troika isn't around anymore. Greece has, some of the best performing bonds in the world. Now what's Syriza about, right? Stuff like that. I'm sure there's other examples we could point to throughout, our story as well. Yeah, that's the big thing, right? Like if there's not that a standard, a solid ideology like what the KKE has, I mean, they still get consistently probably 7 to 10, 12% of the vote.
Yeah, I mean, and there's a party that has also managed to undergo different changes, have different leadership changes, still sort of maintain certain tenets to sort of keep their base. And so there's a rare party in Greece that actually has like a true constituency, a true base. Uh, of course, it doesn't really grow anymore, but this that's rare for other parties. Other parties usually don't have that same sort of consistent. We know that we have these voters. Basically, we have this block of voters in Greece. That's kind of a toss-up. The electorate is quite fickle. We know, we generally have like an 8-year rule that, once you're kind of been around that long, it doesn't matter if people are sort of card carrying members of your party. They'll throw you out.